Good morning, Mr. Nyland.
Good morning.
Now, Mr. Nyland, you are presenting testimony on behalf of the applicant, Invenergy Thermal Development, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And you prepared pre-filed testimony that was submitted on April 22nd in this matter?
That is correct.
Okay. Have you had a chance to review that testimony and the questions and the answers that were provided?
Yes, I have.
And do you have any changes or corrections or additions that you would like to add at this time to that testimony?
No, I do not.
Okay. Okay, you were asked a number of questions and the answers. The testimony has been pre-filed and marked as a full exhibit, I understand. So I would, at this point, make the witness available for questions.
Thank you. Mr. Elmer?
As a preliminary matter, I would like respectfully to move to strike Mr. Nyland's testimony on page 5, line 11, on page 6, line 10, in which he's opining about the state guide plan. That's a matter, as Mr. McElroy adverted to earlier, that has been expressly given to another agency. Mr. Nyland has not been presented as a witness on the state guide plan, and the fact that as a procedural matter, CLF waited until the hearing rather than interposing the objection in advance, I would respectfully suggest should not be a bar to striking testimony that is not relevant to this proceeding.
I would object again, similarly, the questions that you've been asked regarding need and cost effectiveness also ask that you ensure that the need and cost analysis and that the evidence shows that the applicant has provided that testimony and that evidence consistent with the existing laws of the state of Rhode Island and policies. So I would ask that that motion be denied and that you give that testimony the way that you think it deserves.
Mr. Elmer, I'm going to deny your motion. I believe the testimony presented, pages 5 and 6, is relevant to this proceeding.
Good morning, Mr. Nyland, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Elmer.
You provided an alternatives analysis in your testimony that begins at page 11, line 13, and runs through page 17, line 18. Is that correct?
Yes.
And am I correct that in commenting on and investigating possible alternatives to this plan, you evaluated each one of them separately and did not any place in your pre-filed testimony look at them all together cumulatively? Is that correct?
I would say that that is correct, yes.
Thank you. I'd like to direct your attention to Invenergy's response to Burrillville's 7th set of data requests dated May 17, 2016, the response to data request 7-2. If it's helpful to counsel, I can provide copies.
I think I have the cost.
Yes, Mr. Elmer, we don't have that one, so... Okay, do you have copies for everybody? So do you...
Mr. Elmer, just so we're, is that the document you're referring to? Is that in the Energy Facility Siting Board docket?
I believe it is. Yes, it is. And I provided to Ms. Wilson-Frias before the hearing a list of 5 documents that had been filed in the EFSB proceeding, and those were made full exhibits this morning without objection at Ms. Wilson-Frias' request. request. I do have copies available. She's indicated to council 20 copies for the commission and the lawyers, and I do have those.
That's fine, we just need to make it clear for the record.
Okay, and Mr. Elmer, this will be CLF 13 because I don't see it on your CLF list. I might have missed it. So CLF 13 is Invenergy's response to Burrillville's 7th set of data requests in docket SB-2015-06.
Mr. Nyland, I'd like to direct you to the second page of this document, labeled 3 at the bottom. The first paragraph at the top, 5 lines from the top, you say use of ULSD, and that's ultra low sulfur diesel, will be a contractual obligation under the open quotes, pay for performance, unquote, construct of the ISO tariff. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you signed this document at the bottom as being the person who had drafted it. Is that correct?
Yes.
And just to clarify, this is under the ISO tariff. This is not actually a contract, but is a tariff obligation.
Correct.
Yeah. Now, the pay for performance construct of the forward capacity market redesign that recently occurred, is it your understanding that that imposes penalties on a generator, an asset such as Invenergy that has a capacity supply obligation whenever the asset is unable to produce megawatts up to its CSO?
It's my understanding that there could be penalties imposed if a shortage event were to occur. And the shortage event being, I believe, being defined as that the amount of available capacity to meet the need is within a certain limit of, what is the actual load.
But you will agree with me that a generator is not subject to pay for performance penalties if it is not available absent a shortage event being declared by the ISO. Is that correct?
That is correct, yeah.
Nevertheless, Invenergy is asking in its application, in its air application to DEM, for permission to burn oil 30 days in 2 different turbines. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And in your testimony and in Mr. Hardy's testimony, the discussion of that reflects that that is in part because of the obligations under the ISO tariff and the pay for performance construct.
Yes, the penalties can be significant.
Mr. Nyland, on Thursday evening, March 31st, you spoke at a hearing of the Energy Facilities Siting Board, Burrillville High School. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that was quite a number of weeks after the ISO's Forward Capacity Auction 10 was completed on February 8th. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the results of FCA 10, Forward Capacity Auction 10, were known and publicized by the ISO after the auction. Is that correct?
Yes.
You appeared on the stage that day?
I did.
You knew there were 700 plus people in the audience?
It was a full house.
Were you aware of the fact that the fire marshal kept several hundred additional people out?
I was not aware of that.
Did you know that there was a stenographer present taking down what was being said?
Yes.
You knew she was taking down what you said.
Yes.
You said in the transcript of that day, page 16, lines 8 to 11, talking about ratepayer savings, the analyses that we've done looks at what happens to the cost of power to the region when you put in a unit like this. Then continuing on line 15, you say, that's really what the $280 million number represents. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And that number wasn't correct, was it?
Yeah, at that time, we knew the results of the capacity auction. The previous study that we had done prior to the capacity auction, that's where the $280 million number came from. And we were in the process of redoing our analysis, and the analysis is quite complex, as I'm sure Mr. Hardy will be able to explain later on, and we hadn't completed the results of that. So at that point in time, I didn't know what the new number would be, but I knew it would change.
The auction was over on February 8th.
Yeah, and we were notified several days later.
And in fact, the ISO put out on the website what the auction results were that very same week, didn't it?
Yes.
And you say that you were redoing the figures at that time. Is that what you just said?
Yes, it took
And
probably
yet,
2 months to do.
Mr. Elmer, let him finish the question. The answer, I should say, one at a time.
The evaluation is rather complex. As I said earlier, Mr. Hardy can provide a lot more detail as to, what it took for them to do it, but they didn't actually complete the analysis until probably the third week in April.
and Mr. Hardy, in fact, filed testimony after the auction, significantly revising his figures based on the auction results.
Objection to the term.
I'll overrule the objection. It's cross-examination. You may proceed.
He revised the results, I think is the point.
And yet, you used the old figure on March 31st, 7 weeks after the auction, in front of 700 people, even though you knew at the time that that figure was not correct, because you and your staff were working on a revision. Is that right, Mr. Nyland?
Yes, the figure that we used at that time was really the only number that we had to go by. I didn't know the results of the revised analysis, what those results would show, whether that number would be higher or lower.
I'd like to move to strike the non-responsive part of the testimony after the answer yes.
Motion denied.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Nyland, you signed the October 28, 2015 transmittal letter to the EFSB of Invenergy's application. Is that correct?
Yes.
I'd like to direct your attention to page 5 of that transmittal letter.
Page 5.
I'm sorry, page 3 of the transmittal letter, the paragraph under the first set of 3 bullet points, where you say, quote, the region's coal and oil-fired generators represent approximately 28% of the installed power generating capacity and most are more than 40 years old, unquote. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And what you meant in that sentence by the 28% figure is that coal and oil generators represent 28% of the installed capacity within the ISO New England footprint of 6 states. Is that right?
I believe so, yes.
Do you have any doubt about that?
I'm trying to recollect the table that we put together that, derived that number, but I think that's correct.
Is that 28% figure, in your opinion, deeply, deeply misleading?
No.
Isn't it a fact that the fuel mix in the ISO New England 6-state footprint combines to only 6% oil and coal together, and that 28% is capacity, not actual generation?
I don't really see a distinguish between the two. We looked at the capacity of the units as something that the ISO New England relies upon. I think you're referring to their energy production, which would relate to how often they are called upon, but they are still relied upon from a capacity perspective.
Yes, I'm referring to energy and what is actually used to produce energy in the 6-state footprint. Is that 6% coal and oil together, Mr. Nyland?
For energy, I would expect that the existing fleet of older coal and oil units would not be called upon as frequently as the more efficient gas-fired units, just due to their inefficient and costly nature. But the ISO still relies upon those from a capacity standpoint to meet their reliability standard.
In your cover letter to the EFSB, did you clarify that in fact coal and oil together in the energy market is only 6% of production in the ISO New England footprint?
Are you asking me, did I clarify that in the cover letter? I don't think the cover letter states that.
Did you indicate that anywhere in the 400-plus page application filed to the EFSB under that cover letter?
Again, we view the existing generating resources from a capacity standpoint, which we were seeking to get a capacity supply commitment from the ISO.
Thank you, Mr. Nyland. I have no further questions.
Mr. Macaccio, any questions? Mr. Wold? Mr. McElroy?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. I have a few. Good morning, Mr. Nyland.
Good morning, Mr. McElroy.
We've met on the attorney for Borough. As I understand your position in your testimony, it's your position that because ISO New England in FCA 10 gave you an award, that means that there is by definition, I think, as your lawyer stated, a need for that facility. Is that correct?
Yes,
But the award that you received was for 485 megawatts, correct?
that's correct.
And the facility you're proposing here before the PUC as well as before the EFSB is for approximately 1,000 megawatts, correct?
That is correct.
It seems to me that, and let me back up, and you bid the full 1,000 in the auction, correct? Or approximately the full 1,000.
Yes, that is correct.
So you bid approximately 1,000. The ISO awarded only 485. It seems to me that by definition, using your logic, the ISO has determined that the other approximately 500 is not needed. Is that a fair statement?
I think that was the conclusion of FCA 10. FCA 11 may have a different conclusion and select the other half.
Sure, I understand that. But as we sit here today, FCA 11 has not occurred and will not occur in 2017, correct?
That's correct.
Now, the cost savings that you have pointed out, and that I'm sure we'll be discussing in more detail with Mr. Hardy, did those calculations assume the construction of the entire approximately 1,000 megawatt facility?
The cost savings that we developed prior to the conduct of FCA 10 had the full plant output being constructed at one point in time.
Right. Have you ever I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah, so as Mr. Elmer just pointed out, after the results of the auction were announced, we went back and recalculated the numbers on the basis that the first unit was accepted in FCA 9 and the second unit would be accepted in FCA 10.
That wasn't exactly my question, though. My question is, have you ever pointed out what the savings would be looking only at the 485 and not projecting that you will also be accepted theoretically later on?
I think we have that number. I just don't have that number off the top of my head. I'm not sure.
All right.
Well, may I ask that question?
I'm happy to.
Okay.
I'm simply looking for whether or not there has been a calculation of what the projected cost savings would be, assuming only the 485 megawatts. And I believe the answer is you don't have access to that number at this point in time.
Right, that's correct.
And so my follow-up question is, would you agree with me that if you look at only 485 versus approximately 1,000, the savings would be significantly less?
Yes, I would agree with that.
I'm going to ask you a few questions from your testimony. I assume you have it with you.
Yes, I do.
All right, on page 5, lines 20 to 21, you stated that, and wait for you to find it,
I have it.
that Rhode Island has few indigenous energy resources and must import most of the fuels from which its electricity is generated, correct?
Yes.
Well, would you agree with me that Rhode Island will still be required to import significant amounts of fuel for electricity generation, even if your facility is built?
Yes.
Page 7, lines 8 to 9. Over time, the growth of renewable energy resources supplemented by energy storage will hopefully expand to a level that will reduce dependency on natural gas-fueled electric generation. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so, as a result, would you agree with me that the growth of renewable energy resources in Rhode Island over time will reduce the state's dependency on electric generation, such as that provided by your facility?
Yes, the question would be, how long will it take?
Correct, and that's my next. Were you reading my notes? My next question is, how long do you expect that your facility will remain online? I've seen what I think is somewhat differing projections. I've seen some up to 40, some as short as 20. What is your current thinking in that regard?
Typically, facilities like this have a design life of around 40 years. So I would expect that it would be online for at least that long. If you look at the existing fleet of generation out there, as noted earlier, a lot of the existing generation capacity is over 40 years old. So,
In fact, there is some that's over 50 years old.
and some over 60.
There you go. So there is no requirement that generation facilities come offline at any particular time, correct?
None that I'm aware of.
So you're expecting that renewable energy resources lines will cross, and there'll be less demand for the natural gas-fueled electric generation at some point in the future, correct?
Yeah, what I would expect is that as renewable generating capacity is added to a system, and we've seen this elsewhere in the U.S., facilities like Clear River would actually be displaced by wind and solar when they're operating. So what you see as more and more renewables are brought online into a particular region, the existing facilities, the gas-fired or whatever type of facilities they have in those particular regions, they get displaced, so they are not dispatched as often.
So I guess my point is, and maybe I'm not articulating it as well as I should, is that at some point in the future, there won't be a need, or certainly as much of a need, for your proposed facility once this development of renewable resources takes place. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would agree with that statement. I think that would be consistent with the clean power plan, that in order to incorporate, the added renewables, you have to have, existing facilities that have the ability to, when we say help incorporate those renewables, you have to have something that has the ability to ramp rapidly, either fast start or ramp up and down so that it can accommodate the variable production that you get from wind and solar facilities. And then as the renewables penetration, as that more and more capacity is brought online, that would in turn be balanced out by the fact that, the existing resources, the existing thermal resources would not be producing as much power. The demand on those would be reduced.
Right now, on page 7, lines 10 to 12, you talked about Rhode Island is required to rely on a mix of generation technologies and energy resources at the current time, correct?
Yes.
And right now in Rhode Island, am I correct in saying that the mix tends primarily toward natural gas?
Yes.
And if your project is approved, in fact, Rhode Island's reliance on natural gas will increase, not decrease, correct?
It will increase, and again, that I think that the amount of time that it would increase, could be somewhat short-lived, depending upon other retirements that could occur in the state or in the region.
On page 9, lines 11 to 15, you talk about the planned retirements and the at-risk plants that total an additional approximate 6,000 megawatts. Is that correct?
Yes.
These at-risk plants, they have not yet announced any retirement date, correct?
Right, they were deemed at risk by ISO New England.
But there is no way to know if they will in fact retire within the next 3 years, correct?
Yeah, there's no way to know that. They haven't made any announcement, but just in my opinion, looking at the list that the ISO created, the technology represented by that list and the age of the facilities that are included on that list, it seems to me that their retirement is imminent, whether it be in the next 3 years or the next 5 or perhaps 10, you can't say.
All right, that's fair. On page 11, lines 5 to 10, you talked about the last few ISO auctions, and you talked about the SEMA Rhode Island zone clearing at the cap price.
Yes.
And you concluded from that, because the clearing was done at the cap price, which I believe was about $17, is that right?
Yeah, in FCA 10, it was 17, a little over 17.
And that indicated, I think the quote is, which indicated there is need for new generation within the zone. Did I read that correctly?
That's the way we viewed it.
Now, in the most recent auction, first there was a reconfiguration of the zone, correct?
Yes.
And the zone we're in now is larger, correct?
They renamed the zone Southeastern New England, and the SEMA Southeastern Mass / Rhode Island zone was expanded to include what was formerly called the NEMA Boston zone.
Right, so we've got northeastern Massachusetts and Boston in our zone, correct?
That's correct.
If the, by your words, clearing at the cap price indicates there's a need for new generation, what is your conclusion, given the fact that the last auction did not clear anywhere near the cap price? It was down around $7.
It was the addition of Clear River, in our view, it was the addition of Clear River that helped bring the clearing price down to that level, thus satisfying the need for FCA 10.
Okay. Again, maybe I'm being inartful in my questioning, but you've testified that clearing at the cap price indicates a need, and I'm suggesting that because the most recent auction cleared significantly below the cap price, that indicates that there is lesser need. Are you disagreeing with that?
Well, I think probably a better way to say it would be that a higher price, certainly you can't get higher than the cap as set by the ISO for a particular region. That's a clear indication. Even with that said, higher prices within particular zones is also an indication. And given the fact that the Seymour, Rhode Island, now SENE zone, is still an import capacity constrained zone, meaning, having generation located outside that zone, it's not really possible to import that load to serve load in the zone. There's, in our view, there's still a need within the SENE zone.
I understand that that's your view of it. But well, let's back up. In the last auction, what was the cap price?
I want to say it was 1780, somewhere thereabouts. I can't remember the number specifically.
All right. And the actual closing price was just around 7, correct?
703.
And there were many bidders in that auction, correct?
They were.
If your facility had not bid into that auction, would there have been an award made to another facility that was actively bidding?
They could have been. I mean, we're not aware of who the other bidders are. The ISO, keeps that highly confidential.
Well, I'm not asking for identification of any other bidders, but there's no doubt in your mind that there were other bidders who stood ready, willing, and able to put a facility in that would have met the need, correct?
Yeah, we just don't know where those facilities were, or, what the resulting clearing price would have been had we not bid. Our expectation was that had we not bid, then, the clearing price that the zone would have seen would have been higher.
Now, would you agree with me that increasing the amount of power supply anywhere within our zone would be beneficial to Rhode Island ratepayers, provided it closed somewhere near the closing price from the last auction?
Yes, I would agree with that.
So the facility does not have to be located in Burrillville, does it? It just has to be in the zone.
It just has to be in the zone. I think that's correct.
Now, on page 11, lines 13 to 17, you provided testimony about your alternatives analysis, correct?
Yes.
Now, you didn't consider in your alternative analysis an alternative location within the SENE zone, did you?
Objection. Point out that the question about the alternatives you're directed to, I think with regard to technologies, not location, I think the question of siting and location is probably DFSD.
Well, I guess that was really my question. In other words, did you, in fact, look at the issue of not just technologies as alternatives, but a different location as an alternative?
Yeah, certainly we did. When we started this process, we looked at the what was then the Seymour, Rhode Island zone, and if you go back and look at ISO published reports prior to FCA 9, for example, they indicated that number one, the Seymour, Rhode Island zone was still a capacity constrained zone. FCA 9, it had cleared, or even FCA 8, it had cleared, I think, even close to the cap number. They had a published, I forget the term of art that they used exactly, but they had published a number in the order of around 2,000 megawatts that they felt was needed in order to meet the capacity needs. So when we started looking at project locations, we looked at Rhode Island and southeastern Mass, and in doing so, what we do is we look at the locations of the infrastructure that you would need in order to provide, power, electric transmission, gas, things of that nature. And in the alternatives analysis, obviously our company is primarily renewable focused. We would have folks within our wind division looking at, the potential for, larger scale, wind facilities and that type. There were some wind facilities that we did look at, but based on the need that the ISO had stated that they felt that they really needed to have, and, you know, the 2,000 megawatts prior to FCA 9, and then the 1,400 megawatts prior to FCA 10, you know, that really spoke to us as being something that, you know, was more in line with a thermal unit, something that would be able to satisfy that capacity need, you know, in a very, you know, call it small footprint. So,
What specific locations, other than Burrillville, did you consider for a natural gas unit?
it was really confined to where the gas pipelines were and where those pipelines were in close proximity across electric transmission system, you know, at you know, 230 kV and above. And so when we looked at those specific areas, you know, first thing we would do would look at the electric transmission capacity. We have programs internal that allow us to look at what we call the available transmission capacity that may exist on the line. And then we also have the ability to look at the particular gas line to see, you know, how much gas could be, you know, provided at a particular location, you know, for a, you know, call it a specific size unit. So, you know, that process, there were, I think, memory serves me correctly, there were probably 3 or 4 locations, you know, that, you know, met that metric.
Other than Burrillville?
Yeah, other than Burrillville, but
Well, within this-
and I'm not saying that, you know, you had available capacity either on the electric transmission or on the gas. You might have had one, but not the other. And then the second thing we do is we go in and we look at the, you know, the property to see, you know, what is the zoning and, you know, where can you put it? And, you know, ultimately, the reason we selected Burrillville is because, you know, the Algonquin pipeline is within the Rhode Island zone. It only exists in Burrillville, and that was really where the gas pipeline capacity we felt was going to be available in order to meet a project even of, you know, 485 or 1,000 megawatts.
Is Invenergy intending to pursue any renewable energy projects in this region?
Yes.
Could you give us some information about it?
We're looking at solar and wind and energy storage within the region.
Do you have a generalized timeline?
Well, I know, for example, you know, there was a wind project that was actually located in New York, but we provided a bid to the multi-state RFP for the renewable resources, whereby we were proposing that project would have firm capacity, capability via a transmission line to get its capacity into New England. That was a 400 megawatt project in upstate New York. We are currently looking at other larger scale wind projects in northern New England, and we have our solar team is evaluating a variety of you know, smaller scale, 10 megawatt roughly, size solar facilities, and there is an energy storage facility that I'm currently evaluating in north of Boston.
Are any of these in our zone?
The energy storage facilities in the zone and the solar projects that we're looking at are within the zone.
Would the construction of the Clear River Energy Center make those renewable projects that you've just identified more likely, less likely, or would it have no effect?
It would have no effect. I believe that those projects that would be going forward regardless.
In your testimony on page 8, starting on line 3, there's a question about your alternatives analysis in the context of the Resilient Rhode Island Act. You see that?
Yes.
And you know, you described the Resilient Rhode Island Act of 2014 as having a goal and a target leading to the reduction of carbon emissions, correct?
Yes.
And you talk about how your project will reduce carbon emissions in the region, correct?
Yes.
But would you agree with me that in Rhode Island, the carbon emissions will go up if your project is built?
Yeah, in Rhode Island, I would agree with that statement.
On page, bottom of page 10, going over to the top of page 11, you talk about the auction being designed, and I'm starting at the bottom of 10, to select the portfolio of existing and new resources needed for system-wide and local reliability with the greatest social surplus. Do you see that?
Yes.
Could you explain what social surplus is?
My understanding of it is that, you know, the ISO sets the net installed capacity requirement as sort of the target that they're looking to award capacity obligations to. And they are allowed to, you know, bid over that or select over that if in their, you know, calculation they determine that there's a social benefit, and I believe they use the term social surplus, where there's a benefit to the ratepayers in selecting over that installed capacity requirement.
Have you seen the data requests that were propounded by the Department of Environmental Management?
Yes.
And are you assisting in answering those data requests?
Are you referring to the last set?
Yes.
Yes.
There were some statements made. These, in my experience, these were a fairly unusual set of data requests.
I would agree.
All right. And what I'd like to do is just ask you if you could give me your thoughts, recognizing that you are still working on your answers.
Mr. McElroy, could I interrupt you for just a second? Sure. Are these part of a DEM investigation pursuant to the Energy Facility Setting Board order?
I don't know. All I know is that these are the data requests that they have issued in the Energy Facility Setting Board.
Can you turn on your microphone?
Yeah, these are questions that have been put to the applicant by DEM in the context of the EFSB process. They're undertaking to perform an advisory opinion on their own on a number of questions that were asked of them, and that's the source of these questions. They have not been answered yet. Those questions are being reviewed. I would object to any questions being put to the witness with regard to the specific questions at this time.
So just to clarify, DEM was asked to do an advisory opinion as this commission was?
Yes.
Okay, and so these were asked in the context of that advisory opinion?
It's not entirely clear if they're being asked entirely devoted to their advisory opinion process, and or in regard to other permit application materials that that they're reviewing. So they are reviewing permit materials as well, and they have exclusive jurisdiction over some of those areas. They did file these requests in the EFSB proceedings. That is the heading of it. They're in the SB 2015-06 proceeding.
Commissioner, in respect to another agency that's currently performing their own review, we just might want to be careful that we don't enter into their jurisdiction.
Well, Mr. Shore, Mr. Nyland hasn't responded to these data requests yet.
Correct. They have not been responded to.
Why don't we do this, Mr. McElroy? I don't quite know how you're going to ask him questions about data responses that he hasn't responded to yet, but it doesn't necessarily preclude you from asking other questions that you may want to ask as a result of these requests being propounded. But at this point, why don't we take a, you can think about that over the break, maybe speak with Mr. Shore, but why don't we take a 10-minute break at this point?
The docket SB-2015-06 issued a third set of data requests to Invenergy. We have agreed that the section of those data requests, which has a heading beginning on page 7, entitled Purpose/Need and Alternatives, and specifically questions 3-38 through 3-46, which encompasses that entire section. Those are responses that I believe are due at the end of the week. When they are filed, they will be simultaneously filed with the EFSB and in this docket, and I believe certainly by agreement of the town and Invenergy, although I haven't had an opportunity to speak to my other brothers in this matter, will be admitted as full exhibit in this docket. And that will serve to end my questioning on those.
No objection from CLF.
We will
Okay.
take those responses and we will move them into this proceeding as well with regard to the issues identified by Mr. Nyland.
Well, I think that's a fair and sensible resolution of the issue, and thank you both.
Council, could we...
And that will,
Yeah, thank you.
and that will be Burrillville's exhibit, exhibit 2. And I believe Mr. McElroy, looking at those data requests, did you mean 3-46 or 3-47 is the ending one?
Hang on one second, please. I lost my page. Yes, 47, thank you.
That would be DEM's data request 3-38 to 3-47 from docket SB 2015-06.
By agreement, I believe, full.
Is that the agreement?
Yes.
Yes, they'll be full.
I have no further questions, Mr. Nyland.
Is it possible to clarify a response that I gave to Mr. McElroy to an earlier question?
Why don't we have Mr. Shore ask a question? Can you ask him a question, please?
Yeah, Mr. Nyland, I think there was a question to Mr. McElroy.
Sorry, Mr. McElroy puts you with regard to this written in Resilient Rhode Island Act, regional emissions benefits, and carbon emissions from this project. Can you call that question?
Yeah, I believe the question was as it relates to Rhode Island emissions, with the addition of Clear River, would they go up? And what I wanted to clarify or add to the response was that, Rhode Island, is a net energy importer, and so just looking at the production or the emissions of the plants in and of themselves doesn't really give you the full picture of the emissions as they would be allocated toward Rhode Island. And I think the Office of Energy Resources is evaluating, based on the Climate Change Coordinating Council recommendation to be looking at emissions, on a consumption basis. And so, in that instance, when you add a project like Clear River, with its high efficiency, it will be displacing other less efficient, more polluting plants, and so as a result, the emissions will go down. So the net effect of it is that the emissions will be reduced.
And will those emissions, in your opinion, be reduced, including Rhode Island? Including Rhode Island's emissions?
I believe it could be, yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to follow that up a little bit. If that's okay? It's my turn.
Well, we'll go around the table again. How's that? Mr. Elmer, any questions?
I do have a few based on some of Mr. Nyland's responses to Mr. McElroy. Mr. Nyland, Mr. McElroy asked you some questions, and you answered about anticipated future retirements of resources in New England, and you expressed some uncertainty about when different resources might retire. Do you recall that?
Yes.
It's true that the deadline for announcing a retirement for the upcoming FCA 11 in February of next year, that deadline has passed, hasn't it?
It may have. I'm not exactly sure what that deadline is.
You're not sure whether the deadline is passed or not?
Not offhand.
Do you know how many assets announced non-price retirements or permanent delist bids for the upcoming auction?
I think it was a pretty small number.
27 megawatts?
Yeah.
That refresh your recollection? Yeah. And that deadline has passed, hasn't it?
It may have, yeah.
And at this time, no other resources or assets in the ISO New England footprint have announced any intention to retire in future auctions, have they?
Not to my knowledge.
And the Pilgrim and Brayton Point plants that you referred to, those retirements were already calculated in the ISO for FCA 10, which has already been completed, weren't they?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the Pilgrim because their announcement actually happened, I think it was last August, so whether or not they were able to, the ISO was able to factor it into FCA 10, I'm not sure about, but...
Brayton was calculated?
Oh, I'm sure Brayton was, yeah, that had been out there for a while.
And certainly is already accounted for by the ISO in its calculations for FCA 11, which won't take place until next February, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the ISO today has knowledge of all retirements that are expected in the New England region up through and including May 31st, 2021. Is that correct?
Through the end of FCA 11.
Through the end of capacity commitment period 11. FCA 11 will take place in February.
Right.
So we're talking about capacity commitment period 11 that ends on May 31st, 2021. Is that right?
Yes, I believe that the ISO, they got the, whatever notifications that they're going to get from the various generators, but yet at the same time, they still deem all of the units that we had indicated as being at risk. And they're really at risk due to the fundamental nature of those units, and primarily due to their age and technology.
Right, but my questions went to actual retirements that are calculated in the auction, not projections for possible future retirements at a time that is unknown to the ISO and to everybody else in the world.
Right, and as in the case of Pilgrim last year, we would have been sitting here at this time last year, and Pilgrim would not have yet announced yet, a few weeks' time, a year ago, they did. So, those situations can happen. There could be, an unexpected event or some other transaction that occurs that, creates a retirement.
Thank you.
Mr. Mancini, any questions?
No.
Mr. Macaccio?
No.
Mr. Wald? No. Mr. McElroy?
Yes, if I could follow up to Mr. Shore's questioning to you, Mr. Nyland. Again, we're talking about page 8 of your pre-file testimony. We're talking about the Resilient Rhode Island Act. And I think you've made it clear that your view is that analyzing carbon emissions, analyzing carbon emissions needs to be looked at on a regional basis, correct? That's your view of that.
Yes.
What I'm asking you to do, and what I asked you to do the first time, which I believe you did correctly, is to look at it not on a regional basis, which is your preference, but to look at it based on the way I'm asking you, which is to look at it on a Rhode Island basis. And I think you conceded in the questioning that in terms of carbon emissions originating in the state of Rhode Island, the total carbon emissions originating in the state of Rhode Island, if the Clear River Energy Center is built, will go up. Is that not a fair statement?
Well, I think what I wanted to try to clarify, Mr. McElroy, is that, if you're going to look at electric generation in terms of its emissions, you have to look at the load at which the generation is trying to serve. And in Rhode Island, what they've been doing over the past, I don't know how long, but it has been a net energy importer in order to satisfy the load. So, I think looking at, the overall, the generation, balancing the load, looking at that mix, that in order to evaluate the net effect of, where the imports that Rhode Island may be taking and what sort of emission may be associated with that, it's my belief that that would result in a lower emission. If you just look at the fact that you're adding a new power plant in Rhode Island, then would you be increasing emissions if all the other power plants in Rhode Island are operating? I think the answer is, it's clear, it's yes.
Yeah, and that's what I was going at. And you're not aware of any power plants that are currently generating in Rhode Island that are scheduled for retirement in the next 3 years, are you?
I'm not.
Right. So what will happen in terms of emissions originating in the state of Rhode Island, and I understand you want to look at it a different way, and I understand your reasoning for that, but just for my question is, the emissions originating within the state of Rhode Island will go up by the emissions generated by the Clear River Energy Center, correct?
I believe so, but I think also, adding a new highly efficient resource, into the mix, has benefits of improving the overall system efficiency or the system heat rate. And I think that's something that shouldn't be overlooked.
I understand. Thank you. That's all I have.
I just have a couple of clarifying questions.
I just ask some questions, and then we'll get back to you, Mr. Shure, okay?
Before I ask my questions, CLF Exhibit 13 was not on the original exhibit list this morning, and that is the responses, Invenergy's responses to Burrillville 7th set in the EFSP docket. Is there any objection to that being admitted full?
No objection.
I have no objection. Is it in fact the entire 7th set or just 7-2?
7-1 and 7-2.
All right, thank you.
Any objections?
No.
Okay. Hearing none, it may be admitted fully.
Good morning, Mr. Nyland.
Good morning.
Okay, I just have a few basic questions before asking some more involved ones, I guess. What does the Director of Business Development do? What's your job?
It's my job to identify, potential development opportunities within various markets, really throughout the U.S. and Canada, and to identify within those regions sites that could accommodate power generation. My focus is primarily thermal, but as I said earlier, I also assist the solar folks and the energy storage folks, but primarily what my responsibility is to, once having identified particular locations, put together a project team and select the technology that would be employed at that location and how the project would either, bid into the New England ISO, for example, or, whatever other region you may happen to be in terms of, trying to find a capacity or an energy offtake for that particular project.
Okay, so you've been with Invenergy for, let's see.
2.5 years.
2.5 years. So did you identify that another power plant in New England would be a good idea, or were you brought in after that?
No, in fact, Invenergy wasn't really focused on New England. I think, as I said earlier, the primary focus of the company is renewable projects, and that's mostly in, call it the mid-continent area. And, I had, been very familiar with New England, just throughout my career, and I knew that there was a potential for a need for a new project. And, So I identified, potential locations and talked to folks within, the headquarters office about, the potential for developing a project in New England.
Okay, so I want to back up. You said you had knowledge that there may be a need in New England. What did you base that knowledge on?
Just really looking at the capacity, the clearing prices within the various zones, and looking at published reports that the ISO had put out. There was one report that came out, I believe it was probably late in 2013, where they had projected a potential decline in the reserve margin if new projects weren't built, that the reserve margin in certain scenarios could get down to 8 or 9%, which is pretty low.
And so you looked at ISO reports and you said you looked at the clearing prices. Could you just elaborate a little bit on that? I think you've talked about FCA 8, 9, and 10 in this today.
Yeah, 8, 9, and 10, exactly. They were, when you go and you look at a region, one of the things that I do is I'll look at the, the ISO queue, where all the projects that are proposing to interconnect electrically into the system, they file an application with the ISO, and the ISO publishes what they call the queue every month. And so you could look at the, the list of where those projects are. They give you the location. They don't necessarily tell you who the owner is, but they give you the megawatts and the expected online date and those sort of things. So one of the things that you see in areas where, there's a growing need, is you see a lot of people, applying to, get into a particular location. And so when you match that with, reports that the ISO will have relative to prior auctions and what the results of those auctions were, you really get a good sense of, hey, this is a good place to be, in this zone. And in the SEMA Rhode Island zone, because it is still an import capacity constrained zone, that means if you were going to go out and propose a project outside of that zone, in western Massachusetts, for example, the likelihood that, the ISO would deem that as being something that would help meet the need, for, call it the SEMA zone, is, it's uncertain, it's unknown. Whereas, you really need to be in the zone, just due to that electrical constraint. I'm not sure if that answered your question or not, but.
I think so. So, Mr. McElroy was asking you some questions about the renamed zone, the expanded zone. You stated you thought that the addition of Clear River helped to bring the price down in the most recent full capacity auction.
Yes.
Did I hear you correctly?
Yes.
Okay. So now that that auction cleared around $7, correct?
Yes.
What signal does that send to potential new projects that haven't been developed yet? If people are starting to look around and say, hey, where's a good place to develop?
Well, certainly, I think consistent with what I just said, a lower price signal would probably, maybe put some people off who thought maybe that, it would be a good place to develop a project. It may, push them back a bit. From our perspective, for the second unit, we still see it as a viable option. Just by way of comparison, a $7 a kilowatt month capacity clearing price is about, and I'm going to guess, it's probably about 3 times the capacity price that we'll be able to get in PJM based on the last auction results. So it's still a pretty good price.
Okay.
Could you just indicate what PJM is for the record, please?
The Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, PJM. That's the largest, independently controlled ISO market in the United States. It has about 199,000 megawatts of capacity, and it goes from New Jersey, Maryland, Pennsylvania, all the way out through Ohio and parts of Michigan and Illinois.
Thank you.
So it was for capacity auction 10 that a portion of the project cleared, correct?
Yes.
And what does that mean to ISO? You know?
What does it mean?
Well, I mean, does that mean if Invenergy doesn't get built, what happens?
If we don't get a permit, you mean, and we have a capacity supply obligation, I think it probably creates a pretty significant need, you know, to replace that, you know, in their capacity stack. You know, I think developers today, you know, you find yourself in, call it a unique situation. You have to qualify to bid into the ISO, and in order to qualify, you have to provide the ISO and the independent market monitor, you know, a lot of information about the project, your schedule, your permits, and construction, and all of these things. And also there's a financial letter of credit that has to be provided. And so, you know, the capacity auction being carried out, you know, 3 years in advance, you know, you really sort of have to balance, you know, when you apply for your permits, so that you'll have your permits in time in order to build your project, in order to meet that 3-year timeline. But I think as evidenced by, you know, a lot of the questions that we've received on the project, you know, it's very difficult to go and try to apply for a permit for a project that hasn't cleared the auction. You know, because then the argument, you know, certainly an argument that CLF has made, you know, that well, the project isn't needed. If you haven't cleared the auction, there's no need. Why should you get a permit? So you find yourself in this sort of unique dynamic, you know, putting your applications in, you know, hoping you're going to clear the auction, thinking that you will, you know, but, you know, being at risk with that. So, and I think the ISO recognizes that, and that's part of the qualification process that they go through to make sure that, you know, do you have an appropriate schedule and, you know, all of your permits and everything outlined, you know, to their satisfaction, prior to them determining that you are qualified to bid.
I would only object to the extent that Mr. Nyland is purporting to express.
Oh, sorry.
Objections overruled.
So, who do you compete with in general?
In general, well, there, you know, let's just take the last auction, for example. The ISO had reported that over 6,700 megawatts of new capacity were competing in the forward capacity auction. They didn't give you a list of, you know, who all that was or what type of technology, whether it was, you know, wind, solar, demand response, thermal, what have you, but 6,700 megawatts competing for what ultimately ended up being about, you know, 1,400 megawatts of awarded contracts. So, you know, in essence, that's who we compete with.
Okay, so other generators.
Other generators, yeah.
Okay. And what happens if Invenergy, the facility is built, and for whatever reason, it doesn't clear to actually run? Who loses money?
Invenergy. Invenergy has to provide, you know, the financial commitments to support, you know, its capacity supply obligation. So if we're, I think what your question was, if we build it but something happens and the project isn't able to operate, yeah, that's Invenergy's cost.
Okay. And if the plant is built and you don't actually clear the day ahead or hour ahead market, who loses money?
Well, Invenergy would. I mean, you really need to be able to clear those markets in order to get, you know, the energy revenue that you need in order to, you know, pay back loans and, you know, cover operating costs and what have you. So.
Now, you testified earlier that I'm just going to call it the Rhode Island load zone since it's changed names, and I'll say the wrong one.
SENE.
you stated that this is an import constrained zone.
Yes.
Okay. What does that mean? Basic.
Yeah, basic. It means that the electric transmission system, only can carry so many megawatts. And so when they look at, now you have a mechanical engineer answering an electrical question here, but when you look at the zone that we're in, the Rhode Island, southeastern Mass, southeastern New England zone, it's one of the higher load pockets that you have in New England. So, the load, in order to generate the power to meet that load, it really has to come within that zone because you can't get it in from outside of that zone, from Maine or Western Massachusetts or up from Connecticut, because the wires don't have the capacity to get it in there, is what that means.
So why is it important to be near transmission lines above 230 kV?
Just because if you're locating a project and you have to then, route a new right-of-way to get an electric transmission line, it just adds a level of complexity and permitting and uncertainty with, having that new right-of-way, being able to build that new right-of-way. It's difficult.
And are you aware of whether the transmission lines that are near the proposed site have recently been upgraded?
They added a new line that was part of the Interstate Reliability Project. They added a second 345 kV circuit, and our proposed project will be. Initially, when we applied to the ISO, we wanted to just loop in one or both of those lines into the plant, but the ISO came back and said that they did what they call a contingency analysis, and they said, the contingency analysis determined that we really needed to connect in at Sherman Road, and so National Grid said they had the existing right-of-way was wide enough to accommodate a third line, and so that's where we're going.
And is that transmission line in place right now?
The new one for the project?
Yes.
No, it's part of the project. That line will be owned and operated by National Grid.
I think earlier, and I expected Mr. Shore to ask this question, but I think earlier you talked about, you were talking with Mr. McElroy about forward capacity auctions. And could you just clarify which forward capacity auction that the project cleared?
FCA 10.
Okay.
We cleared 485 megawatts.
questions for Mr. Nyland.
Mr. Knowlton? Mr. Shore, any follow-up?
Thank you. Mr. Nyland, in response to a question from council, from PUC council, there was a discussion about the ISO's 2013 forecast of documents, and you mentioned a term called the reserve margin.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could explain what you mean by the term reserve margin.
Yeah, the reserve margin relates to the amount of generation capacity the ISO has available as compared to the actual load. The ISO likes to keep a reserve margin, I believe around 17%, so that you have more generating capacity available than what the actual load is. And the reason for that, if a unit trips or some event happens, that you're able to bring a unit online in order to keep the lights on.
Now, and with regard to a question that Mr. McElroy asked, he was talking with you about the let's call it the fleet of Rhode Island and the age of the other power plants. Do you recall that discussion?
Yes.
And there was a discussion, I think, about how a newer, more efficient project like the Clear River project would displace older, less efficient generation in the ISO New England region. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And then I believe there was a discussion about the fact that there are other natural gas projects located in Rhode Island currently, correct?
Yes.
And am I correct that with regard to those projects, the same rules would follow? In other words, if there's older, less efficient natural gas projects in Rhode Island, would the new, more efficient Clear River project also displace those projects as well?
Possibly. It depends upon where those projects, would be in the stack. The more efficient project would start off by displacing the least efficient project within the stack. Whether that's a project in Rhode Island or not, I couldn't say off the top of my head.
Okay. Are there very old natural gas currently generating projects in Rhode Island? Older projects?
I think that the two oldest ones are probably Ocean State Power, which I think came online in 87 to 90. The Pawtucket Power Plant, I'm not exactly sure when that came on, but I think that's GE 6B combined cycle, has somewhere in the 8,000 plus heat rate. So, they're in the 25, 30-year vintage.
Okay. And now, in regards to a question that was asked by Mr. Elmer about the retirements that have been identified by ISO New England, are you, in your experience in the energy generation market in New England, what other facilities is it that you anticipate, or have you heard or read or have any information with regards to possible retirements?
I just look at the list that the ISO published, for those units that they deem to be at risk. Montville, Middletown, I could go on and on. I mean, several of those plants I've actually been to and been inside, in a prior life. So I'm pretty familiar, with the overall, condition of those plants, and I'm familiar with, their operating characteristics, and I know that, some of those plants can be very expensive to operate. If you look at, I think even Mr. Elmer referred to it earlier, that, their capacity factors, their energy production, was rather low, and I think that's sort of indicative of the fact that, here the ISO is relying on them from a capacity supply standpoint, but from an energy supply standpoint, they don't run that often, and that's really due to the fact that they're pretty costly to run. So, you rely on, revenue from both capacity and energy, in order to keep these units operational, and if you're not running, that's could be a bit of a burden.
And then on your testimony, if you could turn to page 20, your pre-trial testimony. On line 5, I believe earlier Mr. Elmer asked you a question about whether you considered a mix of all of the other renewable and alternative options that you described in your testimony. Do you recall that question?
Yes.
Okay. And if you look at on line 5, would you read the question there to us again?
What about a mix approach of an option going for 100% renewable energy combined with efficiency or demand response as an alternative to the need for Clear River Energy project?
Okay, and am I correct that in that answer that you gave that you did do an analysis where you looked at the mix approach that would looking at a combination of different renewable energy sources such as wind and solar, along with demand response in your response?
Objection, mischaracterized my prior question.
Overruled.
Yeah, we did evaluate, the potential for having a mix of wind and solar. Not so much demand response, that's not, something that we do. You have to have a load that you can have demand response for. We addressed it as a potential for, being able to satisfy need, but it doesn't necessarily provide direct, generating capacity.
Okay, and then on line 21, you indicate that while these projects were all important, they were still a relatively small scale compared to the overall demand required by ISO New England.
That's correct.
Is that your opinion?
Yes.
I have no further questions.
Mr. Elmer? Okay. Mr. Mancini? Mr. Macaccio? Mr. Wald? Mr. McElroy?
No question.
Do you have any questions, Ms. Wilson? Thank you very much, Mr. Nyland. You're excused.